Oh, no, we're not. Now we are. I hope we are. Whoop. Ademal, first question. Can you hear me? Excellent. And I can hear you too. And folks in the chat, I hope that you can hear us all. I hope that you are doing really well. And yeah, welcome. It's time for another Saturday. Ah, interesting. They can't hear you, Ademal. Isn't that fascinating? Let's see if we can fix that, shall we?
I'm not making noise.
Quick, Ademal, make lots of face noise, and we'll see if they can hear you.
Hello, it's me.
More face noise. More face noise.
No,
Ademal, who are you? Tell us who you are.
Oh, God. Hello, my name is Ademal, and I am a author, designer, software engineer, and a few other things.
All-round awesome bean.
Thank you. I do a lot of world building, and I try to help out a lot with World Anvil. If you're in the community, you probably have seen me around.
Yeah, absolutely. So Ademal, or to give him his meat name, Brandon Rockwell, is one of our preeminent world builders over on World Anvil. He also helps us out with some bits and bobs behind the scenes, but he is here today because he is an author and a world builder, and we've been talking about history all month. Now, history is something that a lot of world builders really struggle with because A, it's hard to do, B, there's so freaking much of it, right? Like, wherever you start, history just keeps going back, and it can go into infinite detail if you let it. So it's a tricky topic to talk about, but also it's a tricky topic to write and GM with because it's so easy to start with your players and they're like, tell me about the world, and you're like, right, okay, so in the beginning, and then 4 hours later you've finished telling them the full history of your world, and they're dead people, they don't care anymore. So this is called technically an exposition dump, when you sort of when you expose the history, essentially. So this is what we're talking about. We're talking about how to reveal history without dumping it on people, on your readers or your players. We're going to talk about how to get started with history, and we're going to be talking about some of the mistakes that people make and how you can avoid them, which is of course the most important thing. So folks, those are my questions. If you have any questions, you can write those in the chat in capital letters question and then your question. We'll get that question to us, and we'll be answering questions at about the 2/3 mark of the stream today, I think. So let's jump right in. Oh wait, Secondhand Samurai has shared your links, of course, for the amazing world of Ethnis. So yeah, if you want to check out Ademal and learn more about him, you can do that there. But let's jump straight in. Where do you start world building history? Do you start at the beginning with a sort of in the beginning sort of world creation mythos? Do you start where your story is happening, either your campaign or your book, and then work backwards? Like, how do you start this mammoth task?
I think with most world building questions, it boils down to what are you doing with your world? So for example, if you're running a campaign, then the most important thing is that campaign, that moment in time, and everything else after and before. Well, everything else before that is just setup, and everything else after that is repercussion. So if you're just running a campaign, you want to start in that moment of time and figure out what are the situations that led up to this. And same with novelization. But I know that there are also world builders who go ground up, where they build their world and then they see what stories will happen on it. There's no right way. I think some people might argue that. But I'll hold my ground on that. I don't think there's a right way, because the whole point is telling this story that you want to tell, whether it's the story is the world itself or the story is a campaign or a novel. So I think your jumping in point isn't something to fret about, especially because as difficult as history is, it's also a lot more fluid than people tend to give it credit for.
Definitely.
Because I mean, look at our own history. We're constantly correcting it already. Like, oh, we had that fact wrong. New readings from, this library we dug up show that we had this entire civilization in their timeline wrong. That's fairly normal.
Yeah.
And it's okay to have that in your own world.
Yeah, absolutely. I would also go so far as to say, although history is hugely important for the state that your world is in at the moment that you are telling your story, I don't walk around well, I do because I'm a freak, but most people don't walk around every day thinking, gosh, isn't it interesting that the fact that the ancient Egyptians did this or that has affected our culture even to this day? That is not what people are thinking about. That is not what people are busy with. And so when you start out thinking about your story, you don't have to have all of that detail necessarily. It is interesting, it will make your world rich, but you don't have to build in nth detail everything that ever happened. I think it's that sort of focusing on those sort of crucial impact points that will be relevant during that story.
Yeah, to kind of play off of that, and I think this answers one of the other questions you mentioned you're going to ask, which is, as a world builder, we tend to focus on the total truth of the universe. Like, we know what is the concrete truth.
Right, we're omniscient, essentially.
Yeah, but your players, your characters, and everyone else is not. And so it's good to, when you're looking at writing history and writing about your world, think more about the characters who write it. Like in Ethnis, I've built up several historians.
Yeah.
And anything I write about is going to be through their worldview. And so I can make them say things that are incorrect, but they give the right gist of history. And later, if I change history, I can say, well, they were wrong.
Right. It's the beauty of the unreliable narrator. And that's absolutely something very useful you can do with your history, is you can say this in the mouth of a character, and therefore later you can contradict it, and you haven't broken your world. Somebody got something wrong. That's fine. People get things wrong every day. I was talking with my mom the other day, who's an archaeologist, and she said she'd read this amazing she said she'd read this amazing article which was describing this pet cemetery in Egypt. And historical understanding of the way that people treated animals is that they didn't have pets per se. They didn't have close relationships with their animals. And this pet cemetery just completely blew that out the water. And it's such small detail, but it's on the micro so the macro. People can get things very, very wrong. And just because a historian said it does not mean it's the truth. It means it's an interpretation of data that has been gathered.
Yeah, and actually something I remember reading about once was, for the longest time, history was the realm of the academic elite. Only they got to write history.
Yeah.
By which I mean, like, and we'll see what survives today, but everyone today is engaged in writing something. It's text logs, it's blogs, it's everything else like that. So even if no history is kept, if an archive of a lot of this data is kept, there's something for historians to go through to glean the perspective of the common person.
Yeah.
That common person perspective doesn't necessarily exist all throughout our history. A lot of our views of history are, like we tend to view the, ancient Greece and Rome as like this kind of academic warrior poet state. And really that's just the upper echelons of society who were the ones who had the privilege of writing about history. Sometimes there's a lot we don't know about the common person. And you can kind of fit that into history too, where it's like, these were the rich kids writing about it, and they didn't really care about a lot of this other stuff that happened, or they wanted to show themselves as looking really good.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there's you guys know that I'm a historical musician. There's a lot of stuff that was written about music in the medieval period by scholars that has nothing to do with how music was made, because they were trying to align music with the planets, and people who were actually making music were not the same people who were writing about music. So you get this weird disparity where you read the sources and you're like, yeah, but we know that that's not how they were doing it, because the scraps of information that we do have tell us a completely different story. So the people writing about music were philosophers and religious theorists, and the people playing the music generally weren't particularly literate, they weren't people writing stuff down necessarily, certainly not in treatises that remained around and sort of revered and copied again and again and again, so they survived, right? And you can absolutely do that when you're world building your own history. You can cherry pick what is remembered, what is forgotten, what is presented as fact, and might be changed later. Like that's great storytelling devices, which we'll get more into when we talk about exposition as well. So we've talked about where to start, which is pretty much start with what you need, I think. how do we make history feel authentic? That's the next question, because it's very easy to look at a book and sort of cherry pick a grab bag of, well, here's a plague and here's a natural disaster, and let's have a religious war or three, and I don't know, let's throw in some land grabs because they're terribly important. Let's have some colonialism. I've just been reading about that. How do you make it feel authentic to that world? Is my question.
I think the fastest route to authenticity isn't realism. It's characterization. So, like we said with writing about the historian perspective, there's so much that happens in our own history that seems remarkably absurd. But the more you look into it, the more realistic it feels. Like there's I can't remember which side he was on, but I know he was on the Allies during one of the, I think, World War II. There's a guy called Audie Murphy, and he was this little tiny guy, and he managed to like take out 22 guys in a tank or something like that. And totally unbelievable action movie story. But when you look more into it, you're like, okay, I can see how he has the chutzpah to pull this off. And like things were pretty well lined up perfectly. And so a lot of that historical delivery is, it comes down to kind of the standard, how do I put it? When you make a promise as a writer that like, this will make sense. Like I'm gonna explain it and I'm gonna earn the fact that it has a place in my world. So it's more a matter of just selling it through characterization, through storytelling. They're getting more into the nitty gritty, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I also think there's really a place when you're trying to make history feel authentic to your world, is making sure that you go off the principles of your world. Don't look at Earth history and try and superimpose it over your world. Look at the first principles of your world and figure out, where's the money? Where are the disasters going to come from? What do people need, and how are they going to get it? And pretty much, one could argue that the history of our world is the history of people needing stuff and then doing terrible things to other people in order to get it. Whatever those terrible things are, whether that's, espionage or war or, all sorts of other things that Twitch will throw me off stream for mentioning. But history's kind of horrible. But if you go from those first principles, if I don't know, mana crystals are a fundamental concept of your world, if they're really important and they're discovered early on, that's going to be baked into the history of your world. You need to make sure that that is mentioned, not necessarily in everything, but that comes through frequently in history, because then the history will feel authentic for your world, which is really the crucial thing.
Something that plays off of this and goes into a way I like to do it is you can take that real world event and say, I want this in my world. But then you need to kind of go through a process of natural erosion where you submit it to all of the aspects of your world to make it fit in. So, for example, I decided I wanted to tackle some global warming stuff in Ethnis on one of their worlds. And I was kind of having a problem with that because they have these massive towers that allow them to affect the atmosphere. And I was like, why wouldn't they fix it with that? And then I realized, oh, that's probably what they used to break it in the first place. And so now their pollution isn't caused so much by plastics and oil as it is by them trying to change climates to make certain areas better for crops, and that messes up the entire geoclimate. So you gotta bake it in a little bit.
Absolutely. And sometimes it's about sort of really like bedding it down and knitting it in, and just sort of following those logic chains to, well, if this, then what? Oh, then that. If this, then what? Oh, then that, and then that, and then that. And so therefore this. There's also a certain amount that you can just use the rule of cool for and explain it later, because it is history and it's something that happened a long time ago and people don't remember it. So if you want something really epic to have happened, you can do that, providing it doesn't break your world. And there are always ways to explain it.
Yep. That one kind of goes to the rules of your world having several steps. So like your top step is its themes.
Yeah.
And you don't want anything to break your themes, because then it's always going to feel out of place no matter how you describe it. Like if aliens invade Lord of the Rings.
Middle Earth, yeah.
Yeah, Middle Earth. If aliens invade Middle Earth, it's never going to feel realistic no matter how you sell it. But if you say it's like, creatures rising from the depths of the earth, you get a little more leeway there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so I think I was going to go on somewhere with that, but that's where I went. So
That's cool. That's cool. I mean, I love that because it's, I'm always harping on about, those big six questions, genre, to mood, tone, all of those things. And eventually also the experience that you want people to get from it. So that's either player experience or reader experience. What do you want it to feel like? Because if I'm writing a horror book in the same universe as a fantasy book, I want my readers to have a different experience, right? But it's the same world. I can have the same laws. I'm trying to bring in a different experience. So I will highlight different aspects of that. So if I were, for example, doing a horror setting where I wanted to use history, I would need to make sure that those historical entities were fitting that theme. There were things that were horror. There were things that felt like they fit with that genre, and fantasy or sci-fi or whatever it is. There has to be those elements.
Yeah, actually, Revere by Unreliable is a really good example of that, because it's kind of a historical horror setting. So
yeah, exactly. And it's really important to make sure that when you get swept away with the joy of creating history, you don't accidentally go against your genre, because it really can cause a lot of problems. For example, if you're in a fantasy world and you start focusing a lot on technology, that's going to change the feel of your world. Now, that's okay as long as you want it, but you need to understand that if you shift that focus towards technology, you're going to have more of a sort of Magitech world, potentially, or even a sort of more of a steampunk world, or clockpunk, depending on where you're going with it. So, yeah, you absolutely need to be aware of those themes. Yeah. Anything to add? History, authentic?
I think with a lot of what we've already covered, there might be some people listening who will have anxiety of, like, instead of seeing this as a way to step away from over detailed history, they might think, well, now I have to consider all these other details. And, like, oh, wait, well, now I have to consider the historians on top of the accuracy. So what I'm kind of getting at here is you can plop down ideas and you can refine them later.
Yeah.
And you actually see this a lot in, like, other arts, where you block out everything first in, like, vague shapes, and then you get into detail. So, like, art, you put down some vague shadows that there's people here and things here. Same with world building, where it's like, this general event happened here, and we're going to leave parts of it vague, and I'm going to write like 5 notes for myself, and that's the only rules I'm going to stick to for it. Everything else can be a little up in the air, and that's okay, especially if it's on an unimportant event.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think sketching vaguely, a few details and then lots of vagueness is a very good way to go when you're writing historical events. So essentially that gives the impression that you know exactly what happened, but really you don't. You just have like 2 details that are very accurate. Even a character did a thing, and here is a fact about that character. That can be enough. And then you could just sort of have a very wavy line around it in your mind of kind of, it sort of occupies this space, and it was important, and it was happening here on the map, like in this part of my world. But you don't need to have more details. You don't need to have like the POV of every single peasant in that village where the thing happened. You don't need to have, the diary of the queen during those days. This kind of detail is not important unless it's important for your story, unless you really want to dig into it. It's more just sort of being able to fill your history. There's a wonderful quote from Neil Gaiman, which is that, the depth of the world should seem real to the reader, but often it's just smudges in the background. It's just those little sort of smudgy impressionistic shapes, think Monet, that give the feeling of vibrancy without actually having too much detail in.
In cinema, I think, and in 3D modeling, this is called greeble, and that's the word for all the little bits on the ships in Star Wars. Like, that panel looks like it does something. There's an antenna there. There's a box thing there. That I assume all does stuff, but really it's just boxes and lines used to add distortion, to add noise, to make it look more thought out than perhaps it was.
Yeah,
and you can do that on the nitty-gritty.
So sorry.
And you can do that with any art, and especially world building, where it's like, yeah, we've got a few pieces of lore about this, and that makes it feel like there's this whole huge war that happened back then.
Yeah, exactly. And it's amazing what you can do with just a name. I mean, I think I have the War of the Seven Flags in my world. I don't know what it is. It's just got a name. Somebody refers to that hasn't happened since the War of the Seven Flags, which we assume is some time ago. That doesn't matter. And somebody goes, "Oh, War of Seven Flags. Oh, that sounds exciting. Ooh, I wonder what that is." I will create something for it at some point, but for now, this is a massive. This is like a little detail if anybody reads this book, but yeah, for now I don't know what it is. By book 2, I might have created something for it. It might have more impact on my world. Right now, it's just got a great name. That's all it needs. I just needed a historical event. Something.
Mm-hmm.
And because it fits with the genre of my world, it's medieval fantasy, it fits with the tone and everything else, that was enough for that. And sometimes that is enough for your history.
That does bring me to a problem I ran into with writing. So you're just saying how that can be enough. It's important to figure out what the enough line is for yourself, because when I wrote a book, I had everything well established for the book. By the time I got to the second book, I realized that there was so much world building that needed to be expositioned that it could have been a book unto itself, and the whole project fell apart.
Oy.
So yeah, something helpful to figuring out what your line of like what you need to describe is you need to know your whole story, what's going to matter to that story. Because if you're leading somewhere and you're like a kind of like a serial writer, and you realize by the end that, oh, I should have really built this up a long time ago. And you've probably read stories like that where they bring in something major in the third act, and they're just like, here's this thing you suddenly need to know for anything else to make sense. And you're like, oh, this is a lot of exposition going on at once, and suddenly everyone's talking about it when no one talked about it before. And it's not like it's new to the world. Like everyone's talking about this thing that happened 50 years ago that apparently affects all avenues of life, and I'm only now hearing about it. Like you want to have a good view of where your story needs to go, so you know to bring in from the start.
The typical example of that is a writer will write book 1, and the publisher will go, hey, that did really well, let's make it into a trilogy. And then book 2 is the biggest expo dump, because they're trying to set up the big thing that's going to happen at the end of book 3, that's going to be this big 2 to 3 arc, pretending that book 1 was in on it, but really it wasn't, because do you know what, they hadn't thought about it when they wrote book 1. They were just trying to get a book out. It happens. I could quote, but I won't, 3 different series where I've read that. It's if you're planning a trilogy, children, plan the story in advance. Even if you only write book 1, and book 1 is wonderful, at least then, when you write the trilogy, if you write the trilogy, book 2 will not be an expo dump, because it's really sad when that happens. Pirates of the Caribbean is a great example of that. Pirates of the Caribbean, movie 1, finished, great, awesome. Movie 2, and like you feel like you're swimming against the tide in movie 2, because they're like, and then this happened, and then this is important about the world, and then you also need to know this, because it's all a setup for movie 3. Yeah It
gets messy, and you really have to be ready for that. And that's obviously the more you world build, the more you're gonna have to work with, but then that becomes, you get lost in the world building hole. So it's a balance for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think remember that history is regional, so you don't need to create all the history for everywhere in your whole world. If I'm writing about medieval England, I don't need to create the history of China, because it's not important yet. Some things are important enough that I need to know about them. I need to know that this comes from China and that comes from China. I don't need to build China. Yeah. I just need to include a few details so people know that it's a place that exists in my world. So only build within that scope. I know, again, it's something that I always talk about: tone, genre, scope, scale. Build within your scale and include details from outside, and that will stop you from disappearing down the world building rabbit hole of just trying to build an entire world of deep history with everything, and losing the plot, essentially. But we've been talking already about common mistakes people make when world building history. we really sort of fell into this topic. So let's dig into that in more detail. What are mistakes that you've seen that writers make, that game masters make, and how do we avoid them? Because that's what we're all here for, right? We're all here to learn how to be better world builders and build more interesting histories and deliver them better.
Probably one of the big ones I've seen, at least within the world building communities I've been in, is you've got worlds that have parallel events to our own.
Yeah.
And the writer will get so locked up in accuracy to that real world event, even though they're making like a fantasy equivalent. And they can let it interrupt their plot.
Yeah.
To the point that like, oh, I need to change my plot because the war in the real world happened this way, so that's the way it would happen in the fantasy world. And I think part of that is one, a love for history, which, you know, you can't fault that. But I think the other side of that is they feel maybe perhaps that their own writing can't reflect the accuracy. And that goes back to what we said about it needs to feel accurate more than anything. Yeah. And there's probably like a few disciplines of writing that would argue with that. Like, you know, everything needs to be accurate up front versus build it as you go. But I think that when your world building paralyzes your story, then you need to, the world build is the one that needs to break, because the story is your message. And if you're trying to deliver a message, you can't let anything get in the way of that. Your world build has to bend to it. And I think a lot of the best world builds I've seen come from the idea of making the universe bend to the rules of the story rather than the other way around. Because what ends up happening is they'll world build in systems that really complement that. Like, you know, a lot of magic systems where they're kind of taking the general system versus making a system that fits the theme of their stories. Like Name of the Wind, where it's all about naming things, is it's not really a totally unique system, but he found the magic system that complements his story. You need to write the lore that complements your story, not the other way around.
Right, exactly. And I think also that's where you should focus on in the world, because a world like Earth, any world, is a big complicated thing. Even a fictional world is a big complicated thing. There's a lot of things going on at any one point in time, and the more that you build that world, the more that you write in that world, the more complex it can get, right? So you can cherry pick what you're using for any particular story. You don't need to unpack every single element, right, in your whole world. If your world is about technology and the discovery of a new metallurgy or a new technique of that, you don't necessarily need to bring in magic unless it's relevant. And you definitely don't necessarily need to bring in fashion unless it's relevant, right? Because you're focusing on one part of the world that the protagonist is really interested in, and that's where the development of the story goes. So yeah. I would definitely agree with that.
Actually, on that note of bringing in other things, I think another issue I see even worse than the expo dump is the unwanted expo dump, which is where you go off on tangents about something completely random in your world. And that's one thing if that's kind of the plot of the story. Like if your story is about fashion in the old world, then it's okay to go on tangents about fashion. But if you then go off on like some random tangent about, I don't know, disease rates of the lower east quarter of this one city, and like you clearly are ranting about something from your real life that you just needed to get out on paper, it's probably something you can edit out after. And so, you know, like that's not what you signed your readers up for. You need to know, like, what are they really going to care about? And sometimes a reader doesn't want 500 years of history on a page unless they know they've signed up for a book that's heavily history focused.
Yeah, exactly. As Secondhand Samurai says in the chat, put the elf shoes down. It's all very well to build your history in detail, and this is something that I love about World Anvil, is that I can build in World Anvil as much as I want, and then just cherry pick the details that are useful for the story. without feeling like I'm going to lose all of that detail. Do you know what I mean? Like, I can have that detail, I can indulge my world building passion, but then I can just pick out the details that are useful for the book or the RPG campaign, whatever else I'm trying to present, without weighing it down with all of that extra world building, which I had fun doing, is important for my wider understanding of the world, but isn't important for the reader or the player to know in order to enjoy the story, right?
Yep. Now I'm kind of wondering if that was a pointed statement at me, though, because I think on World Anvil I do have an article about elf shoes. Because the bear and the elf likes and Ethnis have weird feet, and so some people were asking, so what do their shoes look like? And I wrote about it.
No, not at all. So somebody asked me to define world builder's disease, and essentially I defined it as, or my example was, if you build an elven species, great. If you write a little bit about their current dress sense and their current dress fashion, fine. If you write about their shoes because you just want a little bit more detail, like 2 sentences, that's fine. If you go into detail in an article with 500 years of history on the development of how elf shoes have changed, and it is not useful for your plot, you got world builder's disease, honey. Put the elf shoes down. So that is where that came from.
I think I'm the typhoid Mary of World Builder's Disease.
I like to describe Tolkien as patient zero of World Builder's Disease because he's the one where we read his books and we think, oh my god, this world is so detailed, this world is so complete, my world should be like that, and then we all go getting World Builder's Disease. But recently I had somebody on my YouTube channel who got very huffy with me and told me off in no uncertain terms because I wasn't respecting Tolkien enough. So let it hereby be known, I respect Tolkien. Tolkien taught my grandmother. He is a family treasure as well as a national treasure. He had a great sense of humor, so I think he would have laughed at it. But yeah, I like Tolkien. Just that's my statement on that.
Yep.
I have just been told by one of my little gremlins that we have a lot of questions today. So I think I'm going to go on to my final question, which is, how do we deliver history without exposition dumps? So we've talked about exposition dumps already. That's when a character that you're talking to, somebody says the War of the Seven Flags, and then a character says, so what war? And then the character who knows about the War of the Seven Flags delivers 18 pages of dialogue on exactly what happened, who were the protagonists, everything that happened, a detailed breakdown. This information is not important for the book, but you just dump it on the reader and it'll shove it in their face. That's an exposition dump. They can be that extreme. Usually they are less extreme. How do we avoid them and deliver crucial bits of history in a way that is palatable for our readers and for our players?
Off the top of my head, I think I just came up with a writing exercise to teach you how to do this.
Okay.
Take your current time in your world and have 2 travelers from different nations or different countries or whatever, different planets, meet at a crossroads. And they don't speak each other's language. And make them try to figure out as much as possible about each other based off of their affectations, the way they act, everything as possible. So it's like, oh, this guy comes in and he's got this beat up old coat that looks like it used to be regalia, and it has like chevrons on the shoulder, and I lost my earbud.
Oh no.
It's got medallions of lost wars and trophies, and so like you've started to figure out, okay, wherever this guy's from, it's heavy in war, and like maybe it's economically impoverished right now because he looks like he was once a pretty high up person. And try to tell the world through all of the details in it rather than conversation and expo dump, and just do it through the interaction of these characters and see how far you can get with that. And if you can do that, you've got most of it right there, because that's where the history shows. Like, histories are kind of like accents where we don't really think about ours,
yeah,
because it's everywhere around us, but then you go somewhere else and it's completely alien. Like one example of this that I was struck by is, you know, here in the States and in a lot of countries, there's a pretty good postal system. You know, you've got city, county, whatever, street, house number, and like some other details usually. Well, I went to Honduras, and so many of the houses there are painted brilliant colors. This one's bright pink, this one's bright blue, and the one of the locals told us it was because since so many of the roads are unnamed and so many of the houses unnumbered, you would describe where your address is a description of where you are. So it's like the road behind the mountain, the pink house on the hill.
Yeah.
And so you would like that's tells you so much about that country, where it's like everything kind of grew dynamically. It wasn't necessarily pre-planned. That's a good way to like imply that there's not necessarily like a whole lot of civil oversight on who can build what where, which tells you like there's not a whole lot of bureaucracy going on. So take the details you want to tell, boil them down to how they affect the individual, and just slide that into your story. And before you even tell anyone like a historical event, they've already got a pretty good picture of this world.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I would add, and I grew up in an archaeological trench, so just for reference, I would add use artifacts. Artifacts are so important, and I don't mean like ancient amphory. I mean like we in our houses I have a picture of a dragon above my computer. That tells you a lot about sort of the history, the mythology, all of that stuff. If you go up my stairs, there's all sorts of historical ships there because I think they're beautiful and interesting. Like pictures, historical pictures of ships and maps. People keep this stuff in their house. People use historical artifacts as objets d'art, so objects of art, and people keep things that tell their mythology and tell their history as sort of plastic, that is to say, physical examples and expressions of their history and their culture. So that is an absolutely golden way to explain what the space looks like, essentially. And what are you doing? You're setting the scene. Somebody walks into a room, you're toning it. So if you want the scene to feel dark and decrepit, then you have a tapestry that's mouldering at the corners, right? You've just set the scene. You've told them what's in there so they can interact with it. And if you give some detail about what's in the tapestry, you've just told them about a historical event that might be important. So using the setting, the scene setting, and the objects that people have around them as expressions of your history and your culture as well is a beautiful way to do this. I stand by it 100%.
Yeah, I like that. It's a great way to also introduce the character in the same stroke. Your multi-purpose.
Exactly. Anything that does more work, right? I say this as I wrote a 350,000 word novel and then had to cut it all down. Any prose that does more than one job is good prose, and it's the same for your readers. They don't want to sit and listen to you. Sorry, not readers. Your players in a campaign. They don't want to sit and listen to you like read the longest aloud that ever happened in the history of the world. They just want a few details, and if those details can sketch the scene and the history and a little bit about the character and the space, that's awesome, right? You're doing multiple jobs with a shorter text. Yeah,
and for example, which is more interesting, telling someone about a war or having a scene wherein the main character has to break up a bar fight between two old veterans who don't agree how the war panned out. And suddenly, you've established your character, you've told a bit about the world, you've told a bit about the setting because it's happening in a bar or whatever, and you've got some not only are you telling the history, you're telling multiple sides of it, so you're introducing that uncertainty, which you also then get to play with.
Yeah, no, totally. And you're absolutely right. Anything that puts characters in motion whilst expressing world building is valuable. You should keep it. So figuring out a way to put characters in motion is a really good idea. The other thing that you can use, and this is a nice way to include more dialogue, which again, as writers, readers really interact with dialogue. Readers really enjoy dialogue. So including dialogue is a great way. you can use idioms. And you can use idioms for foreshadowing as well. So if we say in English, it's like bringing coals to Newcastle. It's this. You could say it's like bringing water to the ocean, right? But in England, we say it's like bringing coal to Newcastle because Newcastle was traditionally a big coaling town. Now, what I've just told you is that Newcastle is a big coaling town. If that's important later on in the story, you now know that. And what I've done is I've created character, I've created dialogue, and I've also foreshadowed something that you guys need to know in 3 pages from now, and you'll be like, oh yeah, no, I kind of knew that already. And then you make your reader feel smart, which is the best thing you can possibly do. Ditto players. As Long John says, when you drop a hint here and there, and then you let your player or reader piece it together.
Yep. There's actually a really good few pages in Name of the Wind where the couple characters from different countries just discuss their idioms. And it's such a good moment because they bond over it. Like they start joking about each other's idioms because one of them is like, don't stick a spoon in your eye over it, which means don't worry about it. But he's like explaining a little bit about the story behind that, and it's fun, and it makes them friends, and so you don't have to say they became friends. Also, here's an expo dump about idioms. You just did both at once again.
Yeah, absolutely. And idioms are a beautiful way to show culture and all of that stuff. Like it's a really powerful way to show history, culture, all of that stuff, and then also give unique character voice, which is what we're all trying to do with our characters, right?
Yeah.
Okay, I think we better get onto these audience questions because you guys have some excellent questions, and I think it's time to answer them. So, Tillers asks, what should I, under no circumstances, forget for my article for the History Challenge? So I will give some context to you folks. The History Challenge is a challenge that is going on right now. There's still some days left, so if you want to participate, you can do that. And Ademal is one of our judges. So, yeah, good question. What do you think, Ademal? What is vital to be included in your opinion?
The most brutal answer is why should I care? And I don't mean that just as making it engaging, but how does this tie into the rest of the world? If I'm reading an article, I should always know why it's relevant to the world. Like, how does it tie back into everything? If your history is so tight that it feels like a standalone world build of that organization with no respect to the outside world, you've done your world a disservice, and your organization you haven't given it any place in it. You know, like, give me outside viewpoints of the history, give me what's contested, give me how it affects modern events. You know, maybe the timeline doesn't end when the organization ends. Maybe, you know, have a few items beyond, like if the organization has ended, have a few items after its death where it's like, you know, people tried to resurrect this organization. Like, it used to be a cult, and now it's got a new cult leader, and they have tried to bring it back, or put some events before the history that at the start of the timeline that talks about like what led up to this. Like, oh, you know, these people, they found a talking rock in a cave, and 300 years later that became the basis of this cult. Well, okay, cool, this talking rock now has its own space in the world, and like you see it as this thing that's affects the history of this, but is now something else that may have its own history, and now you're wondering about that. And if I reach the end of your article and I don't want to click away to read your other stuff, you've done yourself a disservice by putting a bunch of words down that don't encourage me out into exploring the rest of your world.
Yeah, very cool. Great answer. Fantastic. Question here from Alex Gray. How do you write differently when creating a world for a novel and a game? Very good question.
Well, I guess for one, that depends on the kind of game, because for me, that can apply both to TTRPGs and video games. But
I think TTRPGs, but maybe video games.
I'm gonna presume that. So the thing about a novel is it's on rails. You don't have to worry about people finding the edges of your map because you have them tied to a trail. TTRPGs are a little trickier because the players will always look in the least fleshed out spot of the world that they can find. You may have written 500 years of history over in this corner, and they're going to go look in that corner where you wrote like a note. So the difference is that I think for TTRPGs, you need to view your current moment and then everything else that like as tiers spanning out from that. Like what's the closest information that the players get that they might want to look into? Like if a player is introduced to a word, they might want to know more about it. So anything you've introduced them to, you want to have like at least a good level of granularity on the info about it. Anything that's mentioned in that, you can span out and have a little less granularity and a little less granularity the further you get away from their space. But anything that you mention should be at least partially fleshed out.
Yeah, absolutely. I would add that we are doing a workshop next weekend, and one of the things that Demetrius and I will be talking about is agile world building. So when you write a book, you do some world building, you write some plot, you do a bit more world building, you write the first draft, maybe you do a little bit more world building, and then you write the second draft, third draft, fourth draft. You know, there's a certain amount of bouncing back and forwards, but essentially you're creating a plot, you're building a world, you're writing a novel, and you're releasing it to the world. When you're playing an RPG campaign, from week to week, you need to be thinking about where your players want to go and what they want to interact with and where they are going. And sometimes you'll need to slow them down. We'll be talking about that as well. So that you have time at the end of the session to go away and think and dream and build all the things that need to come next. Now, that's not to say that you don't have an overarching plot, but you don't know what your players are going to want to interact with. So you don't necessarily know where you're going to need to build in more detail. You don't know which city they're going to go to if you give them a choice of 3. And you should be giving them a choice because otherwise you're railroading them, right? So if you want to be a good game master and not railroad them, then you need this technique for world building, which is not just I sit down at the beginning and I build my world, and then the players get whatever they get and they can like it or lump it, right? You need to work with them.
Yeah.
So my big recommendation for this is come check out the Circle of World Builders masterclass, where we will be going into massive amounts of detail about how to do this and how to help your players feel like your world is real and feel like they can interact with things and feel like they're not just on a railroad pushed into infinity. So yeah, hopefully that helps.
And a follow-up on that, I'll be doing the post-stream where we're going to be doing the homework over on our Twitch. So
yeah, Good times, people. We have a bunch of other experts in their field, award-winning game masters. It's gonna be a good time. So if you're curious about that, go to circleofworldbuilders.com. And you can sign up for the newsletter, see the schedule, and take part and get your stuff reviewed by us as well. I think we have time for more questions. Let's have a look. Reading. This is my reading song. If there are significant historical events that create the tone for a story, as we were talking about before, how much detail about that event is necessary? Good question.
Significant event details. That's going to be very variable because you've got like how much does it tie in? You know, is there still heroes alive from that event who are movers and shakers in this timeline? Like in Harry Potter, you had the Order of the Phoenix. You know, that they had this whole thing that happened before the main storyline. I always kind of got the impression that a lot of that was made up later rather than earlier. But I think she left enough hooks into the early stories to make it work. So, you know, it's really going to come down to like how much of it is word of mouth or word on paper that can be proven wrong versus how much of it is, you know, the survivors of this event are everywhere. Like you can't get it wrong because there's so many people who can give you a firsthand account. So you have to have more detail. I think a good example of this that's maybe a little too brutal, but veterans from the World Wars I think we recently lost the last one, or we're down to only a few left. And there's a concern that once they're all passed away, historical record is going to get challenged by people who don't like it more and more, because there's no one left alive to contest it. So, you know, similar can happen within world building, where it's just it's nebulous now because there's no one who can really prove it wrong. Well, there is, but like, you know, there's no, it's all trusting evidence rather than talking to people. So yeah, that's really going to depend.
Yeah. I mean, I would add that events that create a tone for your history don't necessarily need to be terribly important in your story. See, for reference, the thing that I said earlier about the War of the Seven Flags. I don't know what it is. It doesn't need any detail. It's just I needed a thing that sets the tone of the world beautifully, so I pulled it in. As opposed to a historical event that absolutely, yes, this is my cat, absolutely has a huge impact on the events of the story, in which case you need to know enough that there is logic there. And if it depends on the kind of story as well. If it's this cataclysm happened and now your story is unfolding in the aftermath, that's one thing. If the story is, for example, a historical murder mystery, or if it's a kind of revealing secret histories a la National Treasure, then you need to know more. So you need to know just a little bit more than the amount of detail the characters need to know. That's what I would say. And I know that's a little bit vague, but you should always know one step of detail more, because that just sort of fact checks it against your world, if you see what I mean.
Yeah. I think you can't answer this in a non-vague way, just because we're getting into storytelling where it's going to get a bit mushy.
Oh yeah, exactly. And you know, all we can do is try and give you the best advice that we know how to give. At the end of the day, like, we don't know what you're writing, but we try. It's always a little bit vague, and the thing with writing advice is eventually it boils down to it depends. Those of you who joined me on Pen Camera Action 2 Fridays ago, remember you kept asking me like, oh, what do you think about this POV versus that POV? And I was like, well, depends.
It depends.
It does depend, but then I can give you information about what it depends on, right? And that's where the detail comes. Evan RX has a great question here. Are flashback chapters a good resource for showing your history without having a character info dump it on the reader?
Not a fan of those, not gonna lie, but it depends on how it's delivered. I'm not a fan of it, just usually because it feels like it's tacked in to make something make sense. But I know, like, Avatar: The Last Airbender did it well with the Aang, the Avatar, settling a
historical feud.
Yeah, he settled a historical feud, and he's retelling it while we're getting the flashback. That was a good way, because it didn't feel like, oh, we need exposition, so here's this entirely different story that we're going to just drop in so that this makes sense, and we're not really going to relate it to our characters in any way. Like, it came down to characterization. They tied it to Aang. So even though it happened a long time ago, it was a flashback from his perspective, and they kept jumping back and forward instead of just a standalone flashback episode. And when it's standalone, it usually feels like very jarring, because you're not tying it back to the present until the very end. So it's really a matter of weaving it together.
So funnily enough, this goes back to what you said about the history challenge. Why should I care? And that is often a problem with flashbacks. If you're bringing a reader through and through and through, and they're engaged with the characters, and things are happening, and they're swept along with the narrative of your book, as we all hope they will be, and then all of a sudden you put a knife in their throat and drag them back in history to some other point that happened, they're going to be like, well, first of all, I've got whiplash. How did I get here? Second of all, why do I care about this stuff? This is stupid. I don't care. So unless you have a character that brings you in, unless you have a joint moment, one way to do this can be using an item that is in the present and an item in the past. But in general, if you look at the advice that editors give and the advice that publishers give, they often say use flashbacks very carefully, and if you can avoid them, avoid them. If you can't avoid them, make them really interesting and really crucial.
Yeah, so on the note of really interesting and really crucial. There's a show that's heavy with flashbacks, does not tell you until the end. So good. But I want to say it, but if I say it, it spoilers the whole first season because you're not supposed to know that. So it can be done. It's an HBO show. Check it out. I don't know. Go through their list of favored shows. You'll probably find it. But yeah, it can be done, but again, tied to character, make it relevant to the plot. If your exposition is just there to explain one thing, and that's the whole reason for the exposition dump, you can probably put it somewhere else and have it do more work.
Yeah, absolutely. An example that is not an HBO show, so I can name it, is The Witcher. Netflix's The Witcher. Absolutely full of historical jumps, lots of things happening at different times. Now, that show was heavily criticised by a lot of people because they really struggled to understand what was going on. And that's what I was saying about Whiplash. Now, I sat with Demetrius, and we'd already been told that this thing was confusing, so we sat down there and we just sort of like, oh, okay, so this must be then, and this must be then, and that must be there. And we didn't have a massive problem, but we went into it knowing that we would have to figure out what was going on.
See, even knowing, I got lost because I spent more time trying to figure that out and lost plot details because I was sitting there like,
wait, is that her? Oh, but she's old now. Wait, what's happening? Who is, wait, why are you a baby?
At least dress different in the different timelines, man. Change your clothes once in your life.
Oh, man. Yeah, so that is the perfect example of lots and lots of flashbacks, which did cause a lot of people a lot of problems. As I say, a lot of people struggle to understand the narrative. Like you say, you lost plot points. That's an example of dangerous storytelling because you risk your reader or your watcher or your player giving up. They get to the flip the table point and they go, oh, screw it, I don't care. And they put it down.
And I get that it's probably them trying to... There was a lot of exposition to cover. And so they couldn't just stab it in as little flashbacks. They had to really weave it in. But it felt like it was trying to trick me for a while, where it's like, oh, we're leading up to something, but not really. It's just trying to tell you two stories at once. So it kind of... I had trouble. I struggled with it for sure. So
yeah, absolutely. And just as one sort of cautionary tale, there are many more. That's a good one. Prologues are another very dangerous thing. Prologues, absolutely. Modern advice on publishing is skip them, scrap them if you possibly can. Tim Hickson's book on writing world building has very good advice about prologues. So if you want to learn more, highly recommend that book. He talks about how you can make them work and why they often don't. But in general, prologues are often used as a big exposition dump, and they're often used as a historical flashback. And it really can tank if you're not careful, because you spend one chapter getting the reader invested in something which may or may not be terribly interesting, and then you pull them to a different point in the story with different characters, and they need to get reinvested in your book in chapter 2.
Yeah, I my shameful confession is that growing up, and even I guess still sometimes today, I'll skip a prologue entirely. I'll assume that if it's background information, it should be in the text itself. So, and a lot of them were just, they were like, yeah, like you said, they did this buildup of delivery, and it sometimes often felt rushed, because I think a lot of those prologues were written at the end of the story when the writer was like, I'm not building up to this very well. I should slap something at the start to make it make sense. And yeah, it was, if you gotta have a prologue, just label it chapter 1. Trick them.
Which is, funnily enough, what J.K. Rowling does at the beginning of Harry Potter, the first book. Yep. That first chapter is a classic prologue, but she calls it chapter 1, and she actually makes it work very well. So that's a pretty successful one. Great question here from Watcher2417, who asks, how do you manage history in terms of how long an era is? As an example, my history, I'm not going to read that out. That's a lot of information there. How long should an era be is the question.
So my slightly cynical answer is how long it takes the empire to fall. Because eras are often defined by some sort of empire's rise, growth, string. You know, it's either that or it's tech.
Yeah.
You know, like we're in the space age because we got to space. But I think when people look back in like 1,000 years, the eras are going to be differently defined, more around the powers that be. And that's probably a point you're about to make, which is that what people call an era now is not necessarily what they'll refer to it as in the far future, where it's it'll change. So for example, you know, the eras in Ethnis, one is broken by like, well, most of them are broken down by who's the reigning empire of the time. They reach their height, they get too full of themselves, and then for whatever reason they fall, they're torn down, or they kind of just fade a bit as someone else takes power. You know, this goes back also to what we were talking about how historians are the ones who write history, not you. You're making the history, but your historians are the ones writing it, and they're going to say, this is the dawn of a new era, here's our new grand power building up, you know, and we have economic supremacy and all of this. So they are the ones who are saying it's a new era. Now if your eras are defined on something else, which is totally legitimate, like eras could just be another way of time tracking, where it's like, yeah, we have this huge moon that goes around the planet and we mark each era as like a set of years, you know, like every 1,000 years is an era. That's also valid, but you have to ask yourself, why are they calling it an era?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, my case in point is, who's counting? What are they counting? Because in China, for example, they count in dynasties because that makes sense given their political and cultural the political and cultural setup. That's how it works. That's how they understand their history. Dimitri and I have had long arguments, because we are both nerds, about when the end of the medieval period was, because it depends what you're looking at. Are you looking at culture? Are you looking at enlightenment? Are you looking at technology? Are you looking at art? Are you looking at music? It's different in every single medium. So, like the arrival of the Renaissance happens differently in different art forms across Europe.
Yep.
It's so crazy.
I mean, yeah, there's not a day where someone looked out the window and said, oh, the medieval period's over. Look at that. The sky has color now.
Right, exactly. And I mean, in 1751, I think it was, the Gutenberg invented the printing press. In 1451. Get the century right. Gutenberg invented the printing press. In 1452, Leonardo da Vinci was born. And in 1450, Dunstable died, who was arguably the inventor of the consonant major third in music, which would technically be the start of the Renaissance. Or is it? Because what's happening with art? No, we're not getting Renaissance art until later. So these are the questions, right? And this is just one period in one part of the world, right? So I would say, do what is useful for you for an overarching timeline so you can understand your history. And then if you want to go more into detail, it should be culture by culture, because different cultures will understand the passing of time in different ways, and there will be sub-factions that disagree. And, you know, if you talk to the musicians, it's going to be different than if you talk to the masons, and it's going to be different than if you talk to the technology people, right? Everybody's going to have a different opinion within that. So the concept of era is a useful fallacy. It is not real, but it is incredibly useful in terms of just organizing history. Beyond that, it depends a lot on things like communication, logistics, how long it takes for ideas and messages to get from one place to another, because that is pretty much a benchmark for progress.
Yeah.
Consider now the age of technology, when an idea can cross the world like that. Ideas travel much faster. We can have this chat. Exactly. Brought to you by the magic of the internet. This is an era where things travel much faster. Logistics are possible. Things are international, truly international. That wasn't true in the Renaissance. It took a very long time for a painting to get from Vienna to England, for example. That painting, which might epitomize a new art style, might take weeks or even months to get there. And that's how fast trends were traveling. That's how fast information was traveling. And then things move slower, and the state of things changes slower. That's the reality we're dealing with. So yeah, that's I got with that.
we can move back into that. Like, it's not always faster and faster. For example, you know, if humanity was to start like an interstellar empire today, we would be limited by the speed it takes one ships to move and two like communications to bounce back through multiple satellites back to Earth or something like that. And so, you know, the Earth may become super advanced, but these colonies are, you know, 100, 300, 400 years out of date. And so you can, you know, errors become relative again to those.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think that brings us very nicely to the end of this stream. History is a dream, everything is relative, all facts are lies, and yeah, don't expo dump. I think that pretty much covers everything we've said today, right, Ademal?
Yep. Well, yeah, that summarizes it. And then to break all of that rules, obviously it comes down to writing your World Anvil articles. And, you know, you can expo dump all you want in some of those because that's kind of the place for a lot of that sort of thing. Like, you know, you may have your lore articles that are more written from a character perspective. You may even do that in all your articles, or you may be a little more like how I do it, which is wiki format with quotes and stuff like that. So
oh yeah, absolutely.
There's your space to expo dump because people do want that. But that's why people come to wikis and they come to World Anvil and all sorts of stuff like that. Like it's a space that's been wanted for a while because, you know, I don't play much Warhammer 40k, but I like going through the lore and reading the wiki. And so you're going to have people like that where they may not really be that interested in your narratives, but they like digging through your lore and like just learning about all these little things that you've put in your world, like elf shoes, which are valid. You just have to.
I have no
to
problem
be
with
willing
elf
to
shoes,
sacrifice.
as long as they're useful.
You just have to be willing to sacrifice your time, and that's what it comes down to. Is, you know, we've only got so much time to world build. So, what do you really want to focus on?
Yeah, absolutely. I, of course, have been Janet from World Anvil. This is Brandon Rockwell, the author of Ethnis. He is a coder, artist, writer, GM, TTRPG creator. He makes things and he's glorious. So if you're curious, you can go check out Ethnis on World Anvil. If you have not yet entered the History Challenge, I suggest that you do that because it's a great way to put some of these tips into action, build a little bit of history for your world, and maybe win some prizes as well. Who knows? I would like to thank all of you guys for joining us today because you've been asking some amazing questions and yeah, you make it happen. Thank you so much. For the bits, thank you to Basic Dragon. Thank you everyone who followed us over on YouTube and on Twitch. And for the hosts, Laura Bones and Ross Script Writing. Thank you so much. I'd also like to thank Secondhand Samurai and Demetrius who have been moderating in the chat. Thank you so much for keeping us safe, getting me questions and doing all that good stuff. And yeah, I think we are there. We're going to go raid Kaora now. So if you are over on YouTube, you can go to twitch.tv/Kaora. I think somebody will put that into the chat for you. If you're on Twitch, you can just sit back and Twitch will do its thing and take you there. When you get there, shout out Light Up the Forge so they know that we sent you. And I would say that in the meantime, grab your hammer and go build some history. Oh yeah.